We show that actually you can trade off to allow yourself to have more physical qubits and get substantially faster runtimes. So though it requires almost 100,000 qubits to do it in a month, you can do it 4 times faster in a week with only 150,000 qubits.
A few weeks ago, the Pinnacle Architecture paper sent shockwaves through the industry by demonstrating that RSA 2048 encryption could potentially be cracked with just 100,000 physical qubits. It's a massive order of magnitude reduction from the million we thought we needed, and a serious warning for everyone preparing for Q-Day. How long do we have? Can future versions of the approach lower qubit counts even more? Find out in this episode of the Post-Quantum World. I'm your host, Konstantinos Karagiannis. I lead quantum computing services at Protiviti, where we're helping companies prepare for the benefits and threats of this exploding field. I hope you'll join each episode as we explore the technology and business impacts of this post-quantum era. Our guests today are 2 guys from Iceberg Quantum. You might have heard that name, you might not have, but you might have heard of the paper, the Pinnacle Architecture, which is sort of shaking up the industry. And if it's not shaking it up for you, it's because you haven't been paying attention. So I'm here to change that. We have the CEO and co-founder, Felix Thomsen, and we have a quantum architect, Paul Webster. So both authors of the paper and from Iceberg Quantum, as I said. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. I tried to get you on as fast as possible. There are some lag times in podcast world, but I really wish I'd known about this before it came out, so we could have done a whole day of event or something. And why am I making such a big deal for listeners? This paper took us an order of magnitude closer to cracking RSA, if you want to look at it that way. You know, we've gone from 1 billion qubits to 20 million qubits to 1 million qubits, and now 100,000 physical qubits. That's insane. So I guess we're gonna dive right in, and at the same time kind of zoom out. Do you want to explain what the steps were to getting to this? Basically, the shoulders of giants that you built this work on.
Yeah, so I think with that, I'll defer to Paul, who's really, I think, the mastermind behind this work. I was merely lucky to be in the room.
Well, thanks, Felix. Yeah, definitely. So the background is, as you said, there's been past work done on this problem of factoring RSA, going all the way back to Peter Shor in the 1990s, who first showed that quantum computers could do this without the exponential time that it would take in a classical computer, which probably a lot of your listeners know about. And then since then, obviously, it's been a big challenge to answer the question of, if you really want to solve this problem for a particular instance, so people pick the 2048-bit RSA because that's what's, I think, the common standard used by a lot of applications, what would the actual resources need to be? What size of quantum computer, what runtime would you need? So as you mentioned, over the years, then people have taken steps forward. So in particular, I guess, going back to about 2019, Craig Gidney and Martin Eckerer published showing that you could do with 20 million physical qubits, you could break this RSA 2048 encryption in 8 hours. More recently than last year, Craig Gidney himself had another big landmark paper showing that with 1 million physical qubits, that it could be done in a slightly longer time and in up to a week, but still with that significantly lower number of qubits. And that's really the background in terms of the progression of this RSA factoring. The other side that we're coming from is really this alternative approach from the surface code. So all of this work done, by Craig Gidney, was really with surface codes, which is a particular way of encoding your quantum information and protecting against noise, which has been studied now for a decade or really 2 decades, I guess. And a lot of understanding has been built of that. It's in the roadmaps of a lot of quantum computing companies. But there's a more recent approach based on what's called low-density parity check, or LDPC codes. And basically, they recognize the fact that if you drop a particular assumption of surface codes, which is that you only allow in the surface code each qubit to sort of interact with its nearest neighbor in some arrangement. If you drop that assumption and allow a broader range of different architectures, then you can actually have many, many of these logical qubits that you actually do perform computations on in the same or roughly the same number of physical qubits as you might only have a single logical qubit in the surface code. So that's really where we're coming from. We're coming from that angle of using those more efficient LDPC codes. It's been understood in theory then, going back many years, that in theory this should allow you to get these kinds of order of magnitude improvements or reductions in the number of physical qubits. But no one's really put that into practice with a real application like RSA 2048. So that's really where we came in. So, I mean, Felix has very kindly attributed lots of the work to me, but I'd throw it back to him as well. As CEO, him with his co-founders, Larry Cohen and Sam Smith, they started this company, Iceberg Quantum, that really saw this opportunity in the area to use these LDPC codes, and had this vision that this kind of architecture work is crucial to really taking that theoretical understanding and putting it into practice. So that's really what's brought us to that point. Is this is our first instance of an architecture really demonstrating that theory put into something more practical that we could see in the future, done on hardware.
Yeah, you mentioned that, of course, this is the first time you actually applied it to Shores, because LDPC code papers have been popping up. And there was one like a year ago, give or take, about LDPC cat codes for like low overhead quantum computing 2D. But you guys now approached it in a way that you said, we're going to build this model for readers to see. You can factor with these certain sets. And we're going to get into this when we move on. But it's not just a set thing, right? It's not just 100,000 qubits for a month. That's not the only way. So maybe listeners will want to right now dig into this one factor. You can actually shift the number of qubits and affect the time it takes, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So a lot of the focus has been on the number of qubits that you need to realize these, because that's really the biggest challenge in the quantum computing world at the moment. The reason we don't have quantum computers that can actually break these applications is there's a big gap between the sorts of hundreds of qubits that companies are developing at the moment and even the 100,000 that we're presenting here. But definitely the number of qubits is not the only story. So in theory, across any range of hardware platforms, you can solve RSA with our architecture with less than 100,000 physical qubits. But the runtime is a relevant factor as well. For something like the kinds of devices that companies like Google and IBM are developing, superconducting qubits, we get this runtime of a month. A month, I guess, whether that's a sufficient runtime or not, depends, I guess, on the context, how easy it is to run your device for a long period. But also, of course, as you go forward into the future, you can imagine that actors are going to be interested in breaking a whole lot of these keys, which would obviously mean that a shorter runtime would be relevant too. So absolutely, we show that actually you can trade off to allow yourself to have more physical qubits and get substantially faster runtimes. So though it requires almost 100,000 qubits to do it in a month, you can do it 4 times faster in a week with only 150,000 qubits. And then we also explore as well these different hardware platforms which may operate at slower speeds, how you can use that same parallelism trick to still have the ability to solve this problem in a feasible runtime, kind of across different hardware platforms, which is where the parallelism really becomes important.
Yeah, so even if you took 200,000 qubits to get it done in 5 days, that's still, half an order of magnitude better than the Gidney proposal for 5 days, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. That's right. Yeah. I think, like in his work, he emphasized in particular this importance of really focusing in the near term on the low number of qubits. Mm-hmm. So we've taken a similar approach, but absolutely, you can make these kinds of side-by-side comparisons as well. And 100%, it's still significant.
And Felix, with something like this, no matter how many qubits it takes, like even if let's say you get it down to even below this number and it takes a month, whatever, there's still this psychological barrier that once we break RSA this way, it's been broken. Once something's broken, it's broken, right? That's kind of like a cryptographic mantra almost. What do you hope to do in the future at Iceberg with this kind of like approach? Do you hope to like keep trying to lower the count? And what are you working towards basically for the company?
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe I'll take a bit of a step back because I think we dove right into the technical details. But yeah, like we're an architecture company. So we're a startup founded here in Sydney in the middle of 2024, and we're now about 14-ish people, growing quite fast at the moment. But yeah, we're entirely focused on developing these architectures. And in quantum computing, people use the term architecture, I think, quite liberally to mean a lot of different things. When we say architecture, we really mean like the closest thing to what people mean when they talk about architectures in classical computing. So companies like ARM, for example, have their architecture, which they license out. So we're not making hardware, we're not really making software. Some of it is software, but really we're focused on developing these architectures. And so, yeah, in quantum computing, it's more difficult to develop these architectures. because the physical qubits are just much worse than the transistors are in classical computing. And so that's why there's this huge overhead to make the architecture fault tolerant. And we started the company basically with the idea that we can bring down that overhead by a lot. And so we're really thrilled with this like V1 of our first full architecture that we've put out, like a full year of work, showing that we can make it like an order of magnitude better. But yeah, to your question, like we're looking forward to making much more progress in that direction as well. So both in reducing the overhead further, and for different applications, and different. We have a lot of ideas essentially, but then also we're very keen to work with our hardware partners who make the actual physical qubits. So they make the transistors, the much worse transistors, to work towards implementation jointly. And yeah, I think we think it's like a really exciting time, because this, like what you said, it's a pretty, I think the breaking RSA 2048 is the clearest sort of milestone. I think we think that might sort of end up being the closest thing to like a ChatGPT moment for quantum computing, where there's a clear before and after. It's like now we have these very powerful machines. Obviously, we're not excited about breaking RSA 2048 itself. I mean,
yeah, you are.
Yeah,
you are. You would love it if your approach did it. Come on.
But yeah, obviously, I think that the reason that we started the company is because we're like very optimistic about all the useful applications of quantum computers, and especially all the new science and technology we'll develop with it.
Yeah, what you're developing is not just for cracking RSA. There is another use case touched on. I don't know if one of you guys wanted to explain that real quick too, just so people know that despite my jokes, you guys are looking at the entire industry here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we look at this example of the Fermi-Hubbard model. So the idea is that there are lots of kind of exotic materials in nature, or that we could manufacture, that we hope would have really interesting properties. So a good example is superconductors that have this property that you can run a current through them sort of for as long as you like, and there's no resistance. So you'll never get this loss of power. You can just keep running a current around and around. And superconductors are really important in the world today, but one of the main challenges you have with them is that you need to keep them at these extremely low temperatures. So one of these questions that people have had for a long time is do there exist materials that you could really make that would act as superconductors, but do it at room temperature, or do it at a temperature that would be much cheaper to maintain? These are the kinds of materials then that people hope to understand with quantum computers. They sort of depend really deeply on the quantum mechanics of the system. You can't necessarily understand how they're going to act with the more old-fashioned or traditional classical models. And it becomes just too hard with normal classical computers to do all the analysis, to do all the simulations to understand them. So the Fermi-Hubbard model is a physicist's model that's sort of a first approximation of trying to get into these sorts of systems, to understand what happens if you have these kinds of systems where you have electrons that actually interact with each other in really interesting ways. So people hope that if you could do these simulations of the Fermi-Hubbard model, you could learn quite a lot about how these kinds of materials act, and that might be able to be fed in to people who are trying to design materials or trying to discover these materials, to really illuminate, what kind of properties could these materials have, what kind of properties would you need to put into them to give them properties like superconductivity. So in particular, the Fermi-Hubbard models attracted a lot of attention sort of in the field, because it's thought to be a potentially quite early application of quantum computing. So we show in our paper that while in the past that would have taken kind of many hundreds of thousands of physical qubits with these surface code architectures, that in our architecture could take tens of thousands of qubits, or even less than the RSA factoring. So we really study that just as one example of kind of opening up the sort of perspective to all of the different kinds of applications in things like material science and chemistry, which, as Felix hinted at, I think are where the real excitement of quantum computing sort of as a force for good rather than just a disruptive challenge.
Of course. Yeah, for the first 13 years that the concept of quantum computing existed, that's all we thought it would be, right? Simulating the physical universe in some way, because it's a quantum universe, as Feynman
exactly.
said.
That's definitely the origin,
and then we all got obsessed with cracking encryption, and that's how people got funding for years and years and years. And, it's weird. For a while, we were saying, oh, we're going to come up with some useful use cases first, and then we're going to crack encryption. But now I'm starting to think we're going to crack encryption, and then we're going to start doing more of like the chemistry and things like that. So this definitely brings me to a few points. One is you guys just accelerated the timeline possibly. And it sounds like this is just a V1 and you might accelerate it more. So you're going to lower qubit counts, and I got to believe there are still some improvements that vendors are going to make. You know, I don't think the timelines will stand. Some of them might even accelerate up more qubits in a shorter period of time. So these two paths are going to cross soon, and we're going to have Q-Day way before the world is ready. So you know, some things to think about. Now, as I look at the timelines, some of the most aggressive ones are from so-called slow technologies, right? So like trapped ion, that's slower. That's from microsecond going to millisecond. And that affects your calculations a lot, right? If you do this on a trapped ion system.
Yeah, that's right. So definitely a system like trapped ions at the moment, the model that people typically use suggests that it would take 1,000 times as long to do each operation on a trapped ion device as on a superconducting device. So exactly right. We take this into account in the paper. So we look at not just this particular model that might apply to these faster hardware platforms, but really, how do you adjust this algorithm? How do you make it work for these slower hardware platforms? So in particular, what we find is absolutely, well, the headline number of 100,000 physical qubits is what might apply to superconducting qubits, or I think spin qubits are another example of a platform where people have hopes that it could operate at that speed. Something like trapped ions, the result we get at the moment is more like 3 million qubits to do the factoring in a month. So I'd emphasize that that's still sort of a big step down in the overhead from what was done before. There hasn't been, as far as I could tell, a really good analysis of what would really be required from a trapped ion device to do factoring in a feasible amount of time before. I think people had found this slow operation quite prohibitive to that. But the fact that we're able to bring these low overheads really opens up this opportunity to do a really high level of parallelism, to operate with lots of processing units at once to try and speed up the process to account for the fact that each individual processing unit is operating more slowly. The other thing I'd mention on that, I mean, as you've hinted, this is just version 1. One of the pieces of research we actually put out from Iceberg Quantum last year before this, which hasn't yet been incorporated into our architecture, is what's called fast surgery, which is really just a way to try and speed up these operations at the level of the architecture by an order of magnitude. So the hope there is that even if the operations themselves are slower, with these new architectural techniques of fast surgery, we might be able to see order of magnitude improvements as well in the runtime. And if you look at something like trapped ions, where we're really having to dig in and get as much of this parallelism as possible, order of magnitude reductions in runtime could really translate there into order of magnitude reductions in the qubit numbers as well. So it's certainly plausible that once we go into future versions, we could be looking at well below 1 million qubits, even for something like trapped ions. So definitely
that's interesting because so you might lower the requirement for trapped ion. And also I got to wonder about let's say the acquisitions IonQ's been making, like Oxford Ionics is supposed to be faster gate speeds. Have you taken that into account here, or is this based on like what they've been doing so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So IonQ and in fact, originally Oxford Ionics before the acquisition happened are one of our partners. So we have worked closely with them. Obviously, we can only comment on what they've put out publicly. But I mean, publicly, I think our understanding is this kind of cycle time is still about what they're suggesting. You can never, I guess, rule out that there could be improvements made, and obviously, things.
Yeah, you hear statements like their CEO has said we're going to crack encryption in 10 quarters, and he said that a quarter ago. So that's like a little scary.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, so I guess what I'd say is obviously this is part of the open question in the field that we have, I guess, less say on, is how the hardware develops. Obviously, it's a whole different challenge that the engineers in these companies are doing to really bring this hardware timelines forward. And then obviously a whole lot of companies have ambitious targets for that. And I guess, as you said, referring sort of to this idea of Q-Day, I guess one of the most important things we want to get out there as well is just to be prepared for the worst if you're someone who's depending on this encryption. I think that obviously there's always uncertainty about these roadmaps, but I think definitely, as you say, the fact that people are really looking by the end of the decade is kind of the target that some of these companies have, these kinds of qubit numbers, should make us at least sort of want to act quickly to guard against the worst. Even if different people might have different opinions on which roadmaps they think are more or less likely to particular time frames.
And we're under no illusion that there's like a lot of work still to be done, but we're very excited to I mean, with this result, sort of add, I guess, progress at the architectural level, to, progress at the hardware level and at the algorithms level as well. And so I think right now things are accelerating generally because along these three fronts, lots of progress is being made. And I think Gidney said himself, even on Twitter, if you if you're in charge of making sure that you're not caught out by a quantum computer breaking RSA, you should probably plan for the scenario in which there's progress being made. And so, I mean, we're obviously optimistic and we think things could happen quite fast, but we certainly think that, decision makers should definitely, plan for the optimistic case.
So Q-Day could come in secret, right? I mean, like, we might not necessarily know it came. It might not be IonQ or, IBM. It might be nation state. And we all know which one we're thinking of. Like, it might be China in secret, right? It's possible. So there are these concerns. It's hard to detect signs. Like, I'm sure everyone's going to go dark when they're just about to do it. It's not really going to be publicized. But have you been already contacted by anyone as a result? I mean, after you do this 10x improvement, do you start to get phone calls from other countries, from entities? I'm just curious about that. If you can't say, you can't say. But I mean, I think I would notice, but I didn't ask.
Yeah, I've got my own contacts. So I'm not telling you about that, Felix.
So yeah, I just wonder if a certain agency from a certain country or something reaches out to you, like, "Hey, what are you guys doing?"
As a general matter, we've gotten lots of interest and emails interested in chatting to us, obviously, about this result. We are, obviously also engaging with government agencies that are interested in this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I figured. Yeah, that must be a fun phone call to get. So moving on, you already mentioned how you might incorporate that previous work to speed this along. Did you want to touch a little bit on the other stuff that's going on in here too? Basically, it's like 3 core modules, right? It's like there's like a processing unit, magic engine, and like the memory kind of aspects. If you want to just touch on each of those so listeners could kind of understand how remarkable this is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So 100%, as you've said, we divided into these different modules. I mean, I think this modular structure is quite important as part of the nature of having an architecture, to really have these modules be able to sort of plug in different improvements that might be made in these modules going forward, sort of not have the whole thing be the sort of thing where you pull one thread and it comes apart. So we really think that modular structure is important. So in terms of the modules, the core modules are really what we call processing units. And the core purpose of a processing unit is that it has a certain number of what we call logical qubits. So these are the qubits that are protected against noise using quantum error correction, and that we can actually use as the actual qubits that would appear in a quantum circuit for a quantum algorithm that you might see in a textbook. So the idea is that what they're capable of is performing what we call Pauli product measurements, which are just arbitrary kind of quantum measurements across all of the different qubits across the whole processing unit. This uses this technique called generalized surgery that was developed originally by Larry Cohen, one of the co-founders of Iceberg, but has been improved a lot by others since then. And the idea is that allows you to do these sorts of core operations, what are called Clifford gates, which are sort of the baseline operations you need in your device. The second module that we have is what's called a magic engine. And the tool of this is to allow you to do the other kinds of gates, what are called non-Clifford gates, that are the other gates that you need to be able to do a full universal quantum computation. So to be able to really do things that classical computers can't depends on that magic engine. And the purpose of that is really to produce these magic states and to inject them into this processing unit. So that follows similar approaches that have been taken with surface codes in the past, where people talk about using magic state distillation and injecting magic states in that way. Our magic engine is really a way to tailor that to our LDPC code architecture to make it so that you can really sort of use one of these really good high rate encoding dense LDPC code blocks to do this kind of injecting of the magic states so that we don't incur a whole lot of extra cost from that process. And then the third part, this memory, is really where we have a module that stores a whole lot of quantum information. So it stores a lot of these logical qubits, but without necessarily the ability to process. So without needing to do these Clifford gates or non-Clifford gates in general, the purpose is just to have a whole lot of storage that can be stored even more densely with even fewer physical qubits per logical qubit than the processing units. And that was inspired by, again, this work from Craig Gibney from last year, where he had this distinction between hot storage and cold storage in his implementation of RSA. And he has two different kinds of codes, what are called traditional surface codes and then yoked surface codes, which have a similar idea of having this higher rate of encoding of information. That's the same idea that we're taking here. We've adapted that across the LDPC picture. And that's kind of the memory. One addition that we make then that is novel with the memory is that we also introduce this concept of memory as something that can be accessed by multiple processing units at once. And that's something that's really important to the parallelism that I talked about. The reason why we can have 4 times, or like reduce the runtime by a factor of 4 while only increasing the number of qubits by a factor of 1.5 is really because of this fact that we're able to reuse the same memory across multiple processing units. So we can parallelize by having lots of processing units with a single memory. And in this regime, close to 100,000 qubits, the memory actually is the dominant cost. So it's a really big saving to be able to reuse that memory. But those are the three modules, as we said.
So you guys created a new von Neumann architecture, basically.
I don't know if we want to compare ourselves to him, but
yeah,
amazing inspiration, of course.
So would you say that there's a floor to this? Like, how low can we go? You know, like, can you envision continuously improving, improving reuse and all that kind of stuff to get us down to 10,000 physical?
Yeah, so obviously it's a process of exploration to see where we can, like how far we can go. But I would say there's no obvious floor. So these LDPC awesome. Codes, they're quite a versatile set of codes. It's no longer a single code like the surface code. There's lots of different choices you can make of these LDPC codes. We've used a particular family of codes called generalized bicycle codes, which have much better encoding properties than the surface code. But theorists, mathematicians, physicists have found even better codes that could have even more logical qubits for the same number of physical qubits. So in the future, part of what we want to do is to see, can we use these kinds of codes? Can we bring them into our architecture and really bring that qubit number down simply by having this even denser storage with even more efficient codes? So definitely, I would emphasize that in particular, that I think with the surface code, there's reason to think that we might be close to the limit of what the overhead could be, what the number of qubits could be with this 1 million qubits that was reported last year. But that's based on over a decade of optimizing, of taking all this progress you talked about from 1 billion to 20 million to 1 million. I definitely wouldn't recommend the takeaway from our paper being 100,000 as the final number. I think definitely it could be less. And that's another factor that should be taken into account by decision makers and by anyone else who needs to take into account these risks to encryption or the opportunities of quantum computing as well.
Yeah, on that, sure. By the way, I think a lot of people seem to think that we think this is the final thing because we named it the Pinnacle Architecture.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's like the pinnacle, yeah.
And so we just want to, on the record, say it's a type of iceberg. That's the idea behind the naming scheme. It's not because we think it's the end of the road.
There's a whole lot lurking underneath.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, we thought, we name our stuff after different types of icebergs, but I think Pinnacle is the only cool name for a type of iceberg, so I think it's going to be V1, V2, V3 from here.
Pinnacle Infinity will be the next paper on it. No. So a potentially scary question: what happens if you take it down to a number and then you realize, oh wait, this machine already exists? Does it enter into that like disclosure realm? You know, like let's say you found a vulnerability in something, that whole idea of ethical disclosure. Do you feel like at that point it's a different kind of paper and has to be handled differently?
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe make 2 comments on that. So one is, this is some interesting feedback that we had from Scott Aronson, who's a figure who thinks a lot about quantum computing in the broader context. So he raised this question with us and also kind of has publicly raised it as well about, you know, is it the right thing to do as we keep making progress with quantum computing, with quantum cryptography? Should we have a think in the field about whether we do publicly release results like this, if they might have an impact, as you say, on potentially relatively near-term devices? And he had some interesting feedback coming from the cryptography community. So the view that was put forward from there is that in the cryptography community, they've had to consider this for a long time, right? If someone comes up with a new algorithm, identifies a new flaw with a form of encryption that can be solved classically of today's devices, how do you manage that? Is it better to keep that private to avoid bad actors using it, or is it better to publicize it in order to make sure that the issue is understood and that the public can act on it? And the broad consensus seems to be from that field that, subject to some disclosure periods that are relevant in that regime where it really is something that could be used tomorrow instead of years down the track, that this disclosure is really important to make sure that the community is aware of the risks. We'd emphasize as well, I mean, we obviously are a company that's developing a lot of proprietary IP as well. What's in the paper I don't think serves as kind of an instruction set for how to actually do the RSA breaking. So when we actually use our architectures, obviously we work with trusted hardware platforms, and would have that kind of guard as well, that we wouldn't be just offering this out to anyone who emailed us saying, can we have all the details? And then the third thing, of course, is, as Felix said, obviously, government agencies will contact us as they see fit. And obviously, we think it's important to act responsibly with regards to that.
Yeah, there is a short period of time with any kind of disclosure where, you're allowing for certain things to be patched up. But in this case, wow, we're in the thick of it right now, trying to get companies to migrate to PQC, and they're, very slow to do so. So I would like to see that pick up.
Yeah, I think that exactly the fact that we may be talking about a matter of years rather than days, but that it's such an enormous change to make, I think it's all the more reason it's important to have the community be aware of what the risks would be and take into account what possible timelines could be.
Yeah. This has been a pretty great and scary look at this. I'm super impressed. And as these new versions come out, I'm hoping to see more of the practical use cases too, right? Do you plan on, is there anything else coming up that you might want to hint at, some kind of practical use case that you're going to be tackling with some improved numbers?
Yeah, I think definitely in future versions, we'll be hoping to see applications to things like quantum chemistries, different kinds of applications. So definitely want to branch out to that from here. So did you want to add something, Felix, as well?
Yeah, I mean, like in general, like we're talking to people who are more across that stuff as well on the algorithm side, other companies, and we're very keen for generally there to be better benchmarks for us to optimize against. It's not the core focus of us to develop these applications, of course, but yeah, I think especially the answering the question of like the lower end of like what will we do with the sort of the first generation of utility scale systems, like what can we actually do. We're very interested in answering that question quantitatively with our future work.
Yeah. So with those optimistic thoughts and the scary one that there's no floor, and the scary idea that we might be able to lower the trapped ion number by an order of magnitude, I'm gonna consistently say that if you're not migrated by 2030, you might have a problem. That seems to be my opinion for PQC at least. You guys are doing amazing work. Thank you so much for coming on and bringing this breaking story to our listeners. And hope to have you on with the next paper.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having us. This was fun.
That does it for this episode. Thanks to Paul Webster and Felix Thomsen for joining to discuss Iceberg Quantum. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to Protivity's The Post-Quantum World and maybe leave a review to help others find us. Be sure to follow me on all socials at Constant Hacker. That's Constant with a K, Hacker. You'll find links there to what we're doing in quantum computing services at Protivity. You can also DM me questions or suggestions for what you'd like to hear on the show. For more information on our quantum services, check out Protivity.com or follow Protivity Tech on X and LinkedIn. Until next time, be kind and stay quantum curious.